the viewers. We'll start with our class with Block 3 Public Policy Perspectives, in which we'll study two approaches, that is, public policy approach and public science approach. These are the two approaches we'll cover in this Block 3. Public policy approach, it is a study of government and its people. It underlines the idea that government could, by making policy, solve problems of the people. There are five approaches included in it, that are the institutionalism, group theory, elite theory, political system theory, and politically policy outlines. This public policy approach was had the contribution of three scholars. That was the Herbert Simon, Charles Lindman, Stone, Therod Laswell. These are the four scholars who had contributed in the public policy approach. Next, we'll go through the political science approach. Political science is a methodological device by the appropriate many methods oriented in psychology, social research, and political philosophy. Approaches in political science includes positivism, interpretivism, rational choice theory, behavioralism, structuralism, post-structuralism, realization, institutionalism, and pluralism. This political science approach was basically led by the scholar Donald Kettle. These were the two political approaches. Now we'll go through in detail with the public policy perspectives. In the two of the approaches is study in detail. Now, if we say about public policy is an important mechanism for moving a social system from the past to the future. The future requires new policies and choices. Public policy is a field which tend to be defined by policy areas or sectors. Some of the key areas of public policy include health, education, transport, environment, public toilets, law and order, and other urban plannings. So, thus, the public policy approach is all vitally important. Now, the focus of political science and administration has shifted to description of content of public policy and analysis and explanation of the causes and consequences of government activity. This focus involves for the description of the content of public policy and analysis of all the impact of social, economical, and political forces on the content of public policy. In public policy, basically, it has the inquiry into the effect of various institutions and an evaluation of the consequences of public policy on society, both expected and unexpected. Now, what is the nature of public policy approach? The term public policy approach, it is generally contended that public policy has to do with those spheres which are labeled as public as opposed to spheres which involve the idea of private. The expression public policy proposes that there is a dominant of life which is not private or distinctively individual but led to common. The sphere of public interest or public opinion cannot be the same as that held by the private individual. The term public comprises that aspect of human activity which requires governmental inventions to secure public interest. The role of the state has been thus to create the condition in which public interest could be so protected. Thomas Blickland described following key attributes of public policy. Basically, the policy is made to respond to some sort of problem that requires attention. It is made for public on the public behalf. Public policy is oriented towards a goal or a desired state, such as the solution of the problem. Policy is ultimately made by government, even if the idea comes from outside government or through the interaction of government or non-government actors. This is levied by the government only. Policy is interpreted and implemented by public and private actors who have different interpretations of problems, solutions, and their own motivations. Policy is what the government chooses to do or not to do. Taken as a whole, policy may be defined as a purpose course of action taken or adopted by those in power in pursuit of certain goals and objectives. It should be and here that public policy are the policies adopted and implemented by government bodies and non-government actors. We will now explain the concept of public policy, the meaning and utility of policy approaches and models. For better expansion of public policy and its consequences, Vicky Dorer had described 9 elements which are there in public policy approach. These are the first elements is there should be some clarification of values, objectives and criteria for decision making. Second, the method should include identifying of alternatives with an effect to consider new alternatives and to stimulate certain of several alternatives. Third element is that the method should include primarily estimated or expected payoffs from the various alternatives and decisions on whether a strategy of minimum risk or of innovation is preferable. Fourth, it is the first and the incremental change model should be followed. If it is later, the next step would be establish a cut of horizon for considering the possible result of the alternative policies, comma, and identifying the major accepts of result, relying on available knowledge and institution. A fifth element was to analyze of the alternative should deal with both quantitative and qualitative factors in order to overcome the limitations of current system analysis and advance towards policy analysis should be done. Sixth element was the method should include an effort to describe whether the issue is important enough to make comprehensive analysis worthwhile. Then the seventh was the theory and experience, rationality and extra rationality will be levied upon the composition of the mixed but depend upon their various availability and on the nature of the problem. Now, the explorative techniques such as stimulation and the Delft methods should be used as far as they are appropriate, and knowledge from various disciplines should be brought to bear on the issues involved. That is the eighth element. And ninth element, the last one, is the method should include explicit arrangements to improve the policy making of systematic learning and experience, claiming stimulating interventions and creativity, developing the staff and encouraging intent intellectual effects. These are the 9 elements that was included in the public policy decision making approaches. Now, from where the public policy approach originated and how it developed. The growth of public policy as a distinct field of academic activities may be traced to the late 1960s when, as a result of meeting held under the auspices of American Social Science Research Council, two conferences resulted in a collection of papers edited by Austin Rane in 1968. In the 1970s and 1980s, numerous textbooks were published that aimed at undergraduate and postgraduate courses, which were considered with the analysis of policy making and the role of analysis in decision making. Further, in the 1980s and in 1990s, one of the most distinctive feature of the public policy field was the extent to which it had spread beyond America to other countries. Woodstock, this indeed is in a significant development because for the great part of the history of the subject, it has tended to be dominated by American material and ideas. The public policy approach is most closely associated with the contribution of four scholars that are Harold Laswell, Herbert Simon, Charles Lindemann, and David Stone. These were the four scholars who contributed their study in the public policy approach. Now, these four scholars have their different point of views on public policy approach. Now, so we will go through their point of view. First, we'll start with the Laswell's idea on public policy approach. Harold Raswell perhaps stand out as a deeply elements moving spirit behind the growth of a public policy approach. His writings on public policy may be dated back in the 1980s when he was inspired by the Chicago school to be concerned with problems and to take a multidisciplinary approach. Laswell remarked that he thinks of the policy science as the discipline concerned with explaining the policy making and policy executive processes, and with allocating data and providing interpretations which are relevant to the policy problems of a given period. This was marked by Laswell. Further, what he says that policy approach does not mean that the scientist's abundant objectivity is gathered or interpreted data common or see to prefer his tools of inquiry. And he introduced the idea of knowledge of the public policy and argued that distinctive outlook of the policy science is that it is problem oriented. This problem focuses means that subject aimed to be multidisciplinary. It involves the synthesis of ideas and techniques. The policy science could be defined in terms of knowledge in the policy process. And knowledge of policy process, policy science does include uh, one is the policy analysis concerned with knowledge and in for the policy processes. Second, the analysis of policy process. First is the policy analysis, and second is the analysis of the policy process, which concern with knowledge about the formation and implementation of policy, public policy. Policy analysis therefore involved in an era in which government was seen as a problem solver and the political system as problem processor. So these were the two things that was included in the public policy by what Laswell remarked is the policy analysis, and second was the analysis of the public policy process. Now, Simon's contribution to public policy approach is that Simon contributed to the development of the public policy and has been without doubt outstanding. His work on administration behavior in 1947 from 1957 is central to the analysis of rationality in decision making in terms of a sequential of rational stages, intelligence, design, and choice. These were the things. At theoretical level, analysis involved the study of the limits of human rationality in organizational context, while in practical terms it involved designing the organizational environment so that the individual will approach to close and participatory to rationality in his decision. This was the contribution, or we can say these are of the Simon's contribution to public policy approach. Now, the third scholar was the Lindemann on public policy approach. Now, Charles Lindemann's contribution to the development of the public policy approach is equally important. He is well known for his advocacy, often alternative to Simon's, the Western approach in the form of incrementalism. His article, The Science of Mudding Through, 1959, still remains an enriched contribution to the formation of a theory of the policy making process. On the contrary, Lindemann's model 1968 took account of power and interaction between phases and stages. This approach is more politically extended than rational approach. The policymaker under this approach is perceived as a person who does not have the time, money, and brain to make totally different policies. That was the Lindemann's public policy approach. The last scholar was the Stone. David Stone, as his name was. Stone's view on public policy approach This policy focus in political science is closely associated with David Stern's contribution, 1965. He provided a model of the political system which greatly influenced the way in which the emerging study of political or policy in the 1960s began to conceptualize the relationship between policy making, policy output, and its wider environment. These were the contributions of the four scholars in the public policy approach. The main characteristic of Stern's model is that it of viewing the policy process in terms of receiving inputs. Now, Vikrine approach in public policy was also that the social scientists, particularly in the field of policy science, who made influence on the development of model, finalized the policy making process where America, but there were a few exceptions of the dominance of American policy science. A British theorist who wrote Art of Judgment in 1965 was the Sir Gerjo Vickers, Vicarian approach, as we say, of to public policy. Now, his work stressed the importance of analyzing an interaction of value judgment and reality judgment. These were the contribution what he had done in public policy. Now the last one was the scholar was the Dorer's approach to public policy making. Jensek Donor was an Israeli political scientist who contributed to the enrichment of policy making process. He was opposed to Lindemann's incremental position and advocated a modified form of rationalism. He drew from system analysis, policy analysis, and the behavioral science in an attempt to develop a scientific approach to the study of public policy. His work, Public Policy Making Re-examined, published in 1968, still remains an important source of the public policy approach. Why Dorers was more sensitive to the constraint of the policy analysis for the developing countries, brand, and in the case of American and the European text. These were the Dorers' approach to public policy making. Now, what are the models or approaches to public policy? There are a few approaches which are included in public policies. The models were: first is the institutional approach in public policy analysis. Uh, Institutional approach is the in a democratic society, this state as the web of governmental structure. An institution performs many functions, including formation, implementation, and evaluation of public policy. The government institutions give public policy three different characteristics. One is that the government gives legal authority to policies. Public policy is the outcome of certain decision and is characterized by the use of legal sanctions. Second characteristic was that the application of public policy is universal. Only public policy extends to all citizens in this state. Third is that public policy involves the coercion. A policy can waive the idea of capacity for imposing penalties through coercion of a kind usually reserved to the government itself. Since the government has the ability to command the obedience of all its people to formulate policies governing the whole country to monopolize question, the individuals and groups generally work for the enactment of their preferences into the policy. The institutional study has become a central focus of public policy. Thus, one of the model of the policy making system might be called the institutional approach because it depends on the interaction of those institutions created by constitution, government, or legislature. That is the first model, institutional approach in public policy analysis. Next was the rational policy model. That is, rationality and rationalism are the words too often found and used in the literature of social sciences, but they are more widely imposes that practice in policy making. However, rationality is concerned to be the yardstick of wisdom in policymaking. Thomas Day, 2004, equates rationality with efficiency. In his word or policy, in rational policy is when it is most efficient. That is, if the ratio between the values is it achieves and the value it sacrifices is positive and higher than any other alternative. He further observed that the idea of efficiency involves the calculation of all social, political, economic values sacrificed or achieved by a public policy, not just those that can be measured in monetary terms. The policymaker webbed to Russian policymaking must have must know all the society's values references to their relative weightage, clarifying the goals and objectives and rank them. Next was the know we should know all the policy. We means the rational policy. Alternatives should be available. Comparison and consequences of each policy alternative. Calculate the ratio of achieved to sacrifice societal values for each quality alternative. Select the most efficient policy alternative that matches with the goal. That was the rational policy model. Next was the group model. Model was the group model of public policy making is based on the hierarchic theory of politics in which the polity operates as a system of force and pressures pushing against one another in making the policy public policy. A group is of a collective of individuals distinguished by some common attributes or shared relationship. In group theory, policy formulators are often seen scrambling to pressure of groups through bargaining, negotiation, and compromising. Another important dimension of all the group struggles is the maintenance of equilibrium in the system will stop the competition among the group. It does not permit any group to become absolutely powerful in a system for all times. The interest of dominant groups are usually reflected in public policy at any point of time. So these were the model group model. Now, if we go through the another another theory, that is the elite mass theory, in which policy elite preferences. Now, elite mass theory was uh, perhaps in G. White's Mill in 1956 is perhaps the leading representative of the elite mass model. According to this theory, public policy is the product of elites reflecting their preferences and values. Elite or model contends that the people are apathetic and ill informed about public policy. Elite Musk's duty has this summarized briefly by Dye in 2004 as follows. Briefly, he has explained what is elite mass theory. One is in the elite mass theory. First is the society is divided into few who have power and many who do not. Only a small number of persons allocates value or for society. The masses do not decide public policy. Second thing that was there in elite mass theory was that the few who govern are not typical of the masses who are governed. Elites are drawn disproportionately from the upper social economic strata of society. The movement of non-elite and elite positions must be slow and continuous to maintain stability and avoid evolution. That was also included in the elite theory. Elite shares consequences on behalf of the value of social system and representative of the system. Public policy does not reflect the demands of masses, but rather the prevailing values of the elite that was there in the elite mass. Active elites are subject to relatively little direct influences from apathetic masses. One implications of the elite mass theory is that the innovation of public policy come about as a result of redefinition by elites of their own preferences and values. Elitism does not mean that will of the public policy will be hostile towards mass welfare. It was the elite mass theory. Now, the political public policy approach. What was the political public policy approach that was there in the public policy approaches? A significant departure from the rationality model to the political policy approach, process approach imposed in the policy making. People have different ideas about what the major concerns and problems confronting the society and about what the government should do about them. Will stop there for global policy makers must be rely on political process. The political approach or policy analysis lays emphasis on identification of social problems that need governmental action. Second was the reasonable trade-offs among conflicting values at the policy-making process. The third was the search for common beneficial outcomes for diverse groups. Compromise, coalition, bargaining among the participant to win allies. Uh, that was the emphasis that was laid in the public policy approach. Now, strategic planning approach of policy making. Next was the strategic planning approach of policy making. That is, strategic planning is an attempt to combine the incremental and rational approach to public policy making. This approach has the features of reconciling the day-to-day demands with long-range strategies for the future. The strategic planning concerns on the making decisions but blends rational analysis with economic and political analysis. These were the approaches uh, of public policies. Now, what were the limitations of public policy approach? There were few limitations of public policy approach. The approach had models discussed in the unit are mental abstractions or what are considered to be the mechanic and processes of policy making. These are explanatory devices seeking to represent the realities of the policy making process. According to it, has been discussed in the unit that each model has its own angle of vision and no single model is comprehensive enough to embrace all the complexities and subtitle nuances of the policy making process. It must be admitted that public policy is desirable, particularly if it can eliminate poverty, uh, ensure peace, prevent crime, clean the air and water, and so on. So that was the limitation. Next was the any serious study of public policy must be recognized the limitation of the policy approach is adopting the right policy. Some societal problems continue to persist because of the way in which they are defined. For example, if the poverty line is defined as the line that place is one third of the population below it, poverty cannot be eliminated. Similarly, policies that solve the problems of one group in society may create problems for the other groups. Secondly, the expectations may always outrange the capacity of the political system. Moreover, it is quite possible that some economic and social forces cannot be harnessed by government, even if it is desirable to do so. For example, some children may not be able to learn much in public schools, no matter what the government tries to do. So, societal problems may have abnormal causes and consequences, and a specific policy may not be able to uproot the problem. That was the second limitation. Further, if we go on about the limitation of public policy approach, is that the solution to some complex societal problems may acquire policies that are more costly than the problems. For example, civil disturbance, riots, occasional violence cannot be eradicated without the adoption of very representative policies which would prove too costly in democratic values such as freedom of speech and press and right of assembly. The democratic setup of a country is not structured for completely undertaking rational policy making, but solution of societal problems generally implies a rational approach. Instead, the democratic setup may reflect elite preferences, group group interest, incremental changes, or mass influence more than rationalism. So that is the goal. Policy approach researchers for good methods and techniques that help the policymaker to choose the most advantageous section. Thus, public policy approach is a study of government and its people. It underlines that the idea that government could go on by making policy solve problems of the people. These were the limitations and the public policy approach that we had gone through. Next approach in this block is the policy science approach. Now, policy science is an important area which has received wide attention from the policy community. As the term policy science is a systematic and scientific study of public policy. It is contemporary adaptation of the general approach of public policy. Historically speaking, public policy science is very old when seen in terms of general approach to public policy and public advice. In a historical progress has depend on the exemption of interaction of social scientists and social political events. Now, if we in the introduction of the policy science, like many social sciences, has not built up what make 1994 calls a dominant theoretical tradition, or what Thomas Kuhl in 1970 would call it, and then that the just science or paradigm. Today, the policy science have gone far beyond the new native aspirations for societal relevant knowledge. Therefore, the public science scholars should remain vibrant in theory building on scientific lines on how public policy is made. It is one of the most challenging tasks in the sphere of public policy. This unit examines Laswell's another public policy scientist idea and approach on policy sciences. Based, it discusses in the nature and role of policy science. It also critically examines the challenges to public science and purpose in why in which policy science could be amended. Now, what is the nature of political science approach? The concept of political science was first formulated by Harold Laswell in 1951 in his work on the policy orientation, co-edited by Daniel Lerner. His work is regarded as the first systematic efforts towards building a new field of inquiry to deal with social problems. Now, Laswell in 1951 describes policy sciences as the accumulation of efforts to define a discipline for producing and applying societal relevant knowledge. Laswell's vision of policy science is multidisciplinary, contextual, problem oriented, and explicitly normative. The contribution of various scholars through with different emphasis have explored impact on the evolution and acceptance of policy science. Now, policy science is a rational approach to the processes of policy making, as B. Subramaniam in 1980 characterized policy science as the practical applications of all relevant knowledge in policy problems identified well ahead of time. Some writers on the subject argue that political policy science, like physics and chemistry, is a science. The empirical aspect of policy science is stressed by Laswell, thus insist on the empirical creation is a specific that general associations are subject to the discipline of careful observation. This is a fundamental distinction between science and non-science. The term model is commonly used in physical science and policy sciences. This term is used to as a specified representation of some aspects of the real world. It is a technique which helps the decision makers to make decisions with improved method of knowledge. Carlo Wesley, 1977, describes policy science as the decision-driven model of search. This sequential model has the following stages. Now, the policy science sequential model has the stages. That is, first stage is the definition of social problem. Second is the identification of missing knowledge. Third is the acquisition of relevant data using social science techniques. A fourth is the interpretation for problem solution. Then the policy choices. Policy science may contribute to the selection of policy opinion as conceptualized it as two-thirds. It contributes to the way in which policy making is done. Next is the its policy options may be per-located in society, influencing the way that a society thinks about issues, the facts of the issues that are viewed as suspicious and alternative measures that is considered. In sum, policy science have an influence upon the political agenda through sensitizing both policy making and the mass of people. Now, in Laswell's vision of policy science was Laswell's policy science approach is advocated especially to deliberately distinguish themselves from the early scholars of political science, public administration, psychology, jurisdiction, and sociology by posing three defining characteristics. These are discussed in the subsequent section. First is the uh, multidisciplinary perspective. The policy science are distinctively multidisciplinary in their intellectual and practical approaches. This is because most every social and political problems has multiple components closely linked to the various academic disciplines without failing clearly into anyone's discipline's execution's domain. In the words of Laswell, a policy orientations has been developing that cuts across the existing specialization. The orientation is twofold in part. It is directed towards the policy process and in parts towards the intelligence needs of policy. According to Laswell, the policy science are not to be equated with applied social sciences or applied social and psychological sciences, nor he adopts the policy sciences to be thought as a largely identical with what is studied by the political scientists. It is the multidisciplinary perspective. Second was the contextual and problem oriented perspective. The policy science was consciously framed as being problem oriented, called explicit, addressing public issues and posing recommendations for their relief. According to Lastway, policy science were problem oriented and adopted broad textual approaches regarding problem oriented and contextual policy orientations. Laswell's idea was, in part, it directed towards the policy processes and in parts toward the intelligent needs of policy. While distinguished in between analysis of policy and analyst of policy, Alam and Hill observed that the distinction is important in drawing attention to policy analysis as an academic activity concerned with primarily with advancing understanding the analysis of policy as applied. This vision of scientific method and democratic humanism, however, proved operational difficult as the policy sciences moved to realize status and gain academic and conditions during the 1960s and the 1970s. These two approaches, process and each claiming some sort of conceptual superiority. Operationally, the two approaches are policy analysis and policy process. In the contextual problem oriented perspective, uh, operationally, two approaches were there: A, the policy analysis, and the other, the policy process. Now, policy analysis, this model emphasizes policy analysis have been dominated among the economics, operational researchers, and public administration who assume that policy problems and this solution could be defined with rational accuracy and subject to empirical analytical processes. Now, policy analysis, he identified five elements of policy analysis as the identification of objective, specification of alternatives, recommending policy actions, monitoring policy outcomes, and fifth one was the evaluating policy performance. That was the five identifications of policy analysis by Edward Quad in 1975. Second was the policy process. Policy analysis was criticized as being unworked and dangerous. Therefore, in comparison to court model, May and Whitson in 1979 had described a policy process cycle in which they include agenda setting, issue analysis, implementation, evaluation, and terminations. Although these two approaches, policy analysis and policy process, have their own utility and constraint, it would be unrealistic and harmful to isolate them. Third was the third perspective of Laswell's vision of political science was the uh, explicit nominative perspective. The policy science approach is deliberately normative or value oriented. This value oriented was largely in reaction to the behavioralism, objectivism in the social sciences in an organization. Now, as such, to understand the problem, one must acknowledge its value component. Similarly, no policy scientist is without his personal values. Laswell and Kaplan define the policy science as providing intelligence permit to the integrations of value realized by the embodied in the interpersonal relationship but human dignity and the realizations of human capacity. However, this native pace came out to the nationals' attentions to three hallmark of the public science approaches. There is little direct attention to the problem orientations of the activity. The multidisciplinary theme of lightning neglected the normative grounding of policy issues are often overlooked. That is the explicit normative perspective. Now, three perspective of Lansman's policy science was one was the multidisciplinary perspective, second was the contextual and problem oriented perspective in which policy analysis and policy process was there. Third was the expliciting normative perspective. That was the Lansman's perspective. Now, what are the scope and expansion of policy science approach? The evolution of policy science approach, the obvious purpose of policy science was to learn from public programs so that the social objectives could be met with new and effective programs. In many aspects, evaluation was considered to be the policy analysis. Through the scope and expansion, the policy science approach addresses mainly four topics. That is the evaluation, utilization, implementation, and termination. These were the four topics that was covered in the expansion of policy science approach. Now, evaluation obviously purpose the science to learn public programs so that the social objectives could be met and knew the effective programs. That is the evaluation. The next was the utilization. An important issue that was addressed by public science is to relate to the aspect of utilization. That was the implementation. It was felt in 1970 that real culprit of policy failure was the administrative delivery system. Fourth was the fourth topic was the termination. In 1980s and 1990s, the policy sciences advocated focused on program termination under sub-labeled as cut-back management, sunset legislation, and fiscal re-entrenchment. This was in response to the demand for a greater economy and a reduction of government expenditure. It may be noted that efficiency of the program, elimination, evaluation, utilization, and as dominated studies largely failed to provide solid programs advices. These were the four uh, uh, Topics of the expansion of policy science approach: evaluation, utilization, implementation, and termination. Now, appraisal of policy science approach is, as already mentioned, incredibility of policy science has been increasingly questioned. The first dilemma is reflected in what Douglas in 2005 has argued: the dynamic nature of policy science phenomena is rooted in an internal tension, the dialectic opposition between knowledge and politics. In other words, there is conflict between politics and science has knowledge. Second, this science has faced with dilemma of methodological problems. Scholars like Dinson and Fitches in 1993 argued that science of positivism methodology based on tenets of social welfare, economic, easy cost benefits analysis were fundamentally flawed. As such, it should not be astonishingly that result and analysis were also followed. Third, lastly, idea of democratic value was to realize through citizens' participation in the policy analysis. However, the participatory policy analysis has been severely criticized by some purists as being too cumbersome or demanding too much or including too many participants to move towards policy inclusion, especially today's mega policy. Some have characterized it as little more than a publicity exercise. And that was the appraisal of policy science approach. Now, what were the new directions and perspectives in policy science approach? Although policy research still continues to produce the most systematic and critical analysis of complex social problems, the two terms have remained prominent on the agenda for policy sciences since 1980. First, the policy science were to become normative, and second, policy science were to be related to the emerging field of public management. One, the first direction, new direction for our the in the public perspectives were: first was the continuing of values and policy science. Ethical values are important for governance, government and society. Keep politics and administration separate. So it was argued that theoretical prevention of political power may corrupt bureaucracy. Similarly, introducing new measures to ensure public accountability of higher bureaucracy would provide the moral safeguard against ethical transactions. That was the first direction, that it should be continuity of values in political science. Second direction was focus on public management. Policy remains just a policy statement unless it is implemented first on public management, like policy shares, agenda, disciplines, traditional objective, discipline bound, social sciences, inquiry, and preferred the multidisciplinary problem oriented and explicit normative nature of his policy oriented scheme. Third direction was the continuity of relevance. It should be continued. It may be argued that policy science has achieved great deal in alternative landscape of academic and public organization. As an approach, it is relevant for resolving complex social and political issues. Most of social and economic policies are issues of public concern. Fourth direction was the emphasis of policy inquiry. The reason approach has added advantage of furthering the content-oriented and explicitly normative nature of the policy science. New approaches in the policy science appear to be the basis on the theory of applied reason and communication in the society. The method of policy inquiry argumented promises not only to meet the goals set down by the theory of the reason of society, but also to integrate the process and content divergence that reason within the policy sciences. Fifth direction was the democratization of policy sciences. It appears necessary for the policy sciences to achieve their last man's goal of policy sciences of democracy, because the human condition is often temporarily beyond quantitative captured, but this post positive approach to the democratization combined with participatory policy analysis is not without shortcoming, but it promises a new vision for the future. So, sixth direction was the it should be social network analysis. The network approach looks at the policy process in terms of the horizontal relationship that tend to define the development of public policy. Although there are certain certainty in some problems, in many ways, social network analysis provides the policy science with a methodological approach that is convenient with the wide range of institutional actors who form the policy process. Thus, a network approach is useful, but Carson has claimed as of now it is not a viable approach for policy sciences. Therefore, there are six new directions and perspective in the policy science approach. Uh, First is the first one is the continuity of values in policy science. Second is the focus on public management. Third is the continuity of relevance. Fourth is the emphasis on policy inquiry. Fifth, democratization of policy sciences. And sixth is the social network analysis. These were the six new directions and perspectives in the policy science approach. Now, with all this, we'll just go through the policy science approach once again, just to regain. In policy science, what we have gone through in this unit is in policy science approach, we have uh, studied the nature of policy science approach, in which policy science is a rational approach to the process of policy making, and it is the knowledge in the social, physical, and natural sciences to specific problems to identify well ahead of the time. Some writers of the subject argue that policy science, like physics, chemistry, is not a science. Empirically aspect of policy science is stressed by the last one. Thus, to insist on the empirical criteria is to specify that gender associates are subject to the discipline of careful observation. That was the nature of policy science approach. Now, the last one's vision of policy science, as we have gone through, we have discussed it. These are the discussed in these subsequent subsection. In Laswell's policy science, he characterized policy science as one, as it is multidisciplinary perspective. Second was the contextual and problem oriented perspective, in which policy analysis and policy process was there. Third was the expliciting normative perspective. These were the three perspectives included in the Laswell's vision of policy science. Now, further, we had studied the scope and expansion of policy science approach. In the expansion of policy science approach, four main topics were addresses. First was the evaluation, second, utilization, implementation, and termination. These four were the topics of expansion and scope of policy science approach. In the appraisal also, in appraisal of policy science approach, we have just gone through, explained that what were the uh, three topics which was there. In other words, there was the conflict between politics and the science as knowledge. Second, it was science was faced with the dilemma of methodological problem. Third, last was idea of democratic value was also to be realized through citizen participation in the policy analysis. Last in the policy science approach was the new directions and perspectives that was there in policy science approach. One first direction is the continuity of values and policy sciences. Second is the focus on public management. Third is the continuity of relevance. Fourth is the emphasis on policy inquiry. Fifth is the democratization of policy sciences. And sixth direction was the social network analysis. This was the policy science approach, as we have gone through in our unit. If now in if we go back in unit 8, what we had here, we'll just go through the public policy approach also. The nature of the public policy approach, the term public comprises that aspect of human activity which acquires governmental intervention to secure public interest. That is the nature of the public policy. Policy is made to respond to some sort of problems that requires attention. Policy is made on the public behalf. It is goal oriented or desired by states such as the solution to the problem. That is the nature. The method should include an effort to describe whether the issue is important enough to make more comprehensive analysis worthwhile. That is the nature of the public policy approach. It originated from basically from the American Social Science Research Council. Two conferences resulted in the collection of papers edited by Austin Rene in 1968, and further in 1977 1980 it was textbooks were published. In 1980 and in 1990s, distinctive features of public policy was extended by the American to the other countries also. The four scholars of public policy approaches was the Harlot Laswell, Herbert Simon, Charles Lindemann, and David Stone. These were the basic four scholars of public policy approach that we have already gone through. Different views of public policy approaches, as by the Laswell's remark, the policy analysis and or analysis of the policy process. What were the contributions of Laswell? We have gone through Simon's contribution to public policy approach, Nimmel's on public policy approach, Easton view on public policies approach, Vicarian approach to public policy, Doral's approach to public policy making. We have already discussed this. I'm just going through it. Now, the approaches or the models of public policy was the first was the institutional approach, second was the rational policy making model, third was the group model policy or group equilibrium. Then it came the elite mass theory, policy elite preferences, political public policy approach, and what were the strategical planning approach. Next was the planning approach of policy making, and then we had gone through the public policy. What were the limitations? Limitations that were there in the public policy. We have all gone through the four limitation was we have all discussed in this class. Any serious study of public policy must be recognized the limitation of policy approach. Expectations were made always outpraise the capacity of the political system approach. These two approaches we have covered in our block 3. Block 3, public policy perspective. We have covered two approaches in this section of class. That one is the public policy approach, and the second is the public science approach. Now, public policy approach, it is studied by the government and its people, is undertaking the idea of the government. Would also be four basic, we can say four scholars were there in public policy approach. Harlow, Lansman, Herbert Simons, Charles Lindemann, Stone, these four were the scholars of public policy approach. And then we had gone through the science approach that was basically by Donald Kettle, in which the technology reserved the appropriate many methods and political philosophies approaches include the positivism, interpretism, rationalism, choices, behavioralism, structuralism, past choice theory, realization, institutionalism, and so on. So, In this class, we have covered block 3, public policy perspective. In our next class, we will go through the next block, that is block 4.